There was just enough light to see the yard when I opened the door. The air was still cool, and moisture from the night before clung to the trees. Near the porch steps, one leaf stuck out from a bush, with several small drops of dew resting close together on its surface. A larger drop sat near the edge, clear enough to hold a tiny piece of the sky inside it. I sat down in the same chair as the day before and wrapped both hands around a cup of warm tea. My phone was still inside, the laptop was closed, the guitar leaned against the wall, and the book I hadn't finished was lying face down on the table. After a few days here, I was starting to get used to not reaching for my phone as soon as I woke up. My portfolio was still there. The market still opened and closed every day, but I wasn't checking the market board anymore. At first, my hand would still reach for the phone out of habit. The app icon was still in the same place. I would notice it, then move on to something else. Some trading sessions passed without me even knowing how much the stocks had gone up or down. That almost never used to happen. I finished my tea, took the cup inside, then brought the meditation cushion out to the porch. There was still a very faint ache in my abdomen as I sat down. I crossed my legs, straightened my back just enough, and closed my eyes. The birds came first. Then I heard the wind moving through. I breathed in, felt my abdomen tighten slightly, then soften again. A few thoughts appeared. Some were about work. Others seemed to come from nowhere. I noticed them, then heard the wind again. Before long, my attention had already followed something else. I still couldn't sit as quietly as I'd once imagined people were supposed to sit when they meditated. But I no longer felt like I had to make everything in my mind go silent. Sometimes I could stay with a few breaths in a row. Then another story would carry my attention far away before I noticed. Every now and then, a slight pain in my abdomen would bring my attention back there for a few breaths. Then it would ease on its own. When I opened my eyes, a strip of sunlight had reached the porch floor beside the cushion. I stood up and walked over to the leaf I'd noticed earlier. The surface was dry. The drops of dew were gone. I looked at the leaves around it, almost as if I might find those same drops somewhere else. But all I could see were small patches of sunlight reflecting off the leaves. I went back inside and opened my laptop. Several new emails had arrived. One of the things I'd still been handling myself before going to the hospital had a long chain of new messages. I scrolled through them, getting ready to reply, and realized that a coworker had already taken care of the rest. The issue had been resolved, and the document had already been sent. The cursor blinked inside an empty reply box. I read the last few messages again, then closed the window. Another task came up. I handled what was needed, sent it off, then shut the laptop earlier than I had during my first few days here. The stock market app was still there, but I didn't open it. I pushed the door open. Heat from the yard rushed inside, completely different from the cool air I'd felt while drinking tea that morning. The chair on the porch had already warmed in the sun. I walked into the yard and stopped near a bush by the fence. A flower had just bloomed. Its petals were still full and firm, its color standing out against the green leaves around it. I bent down for a closer look, then kept walking. The small road still curved along the hillside. A few days ago, everything had felt unfamiliar. Now I knew which sections were steeper, where the dog usually lay outside one of the houses, and where I could look down at the rooftops below. My abdomen was barely making me slow down anymore. I walked farther than I had on the previous days. As I followed the road back toward the house, the wind began to pick up. The trees ahead leaned in the same direction. The sky, bright only moments earlier, quickly grew dark. I walked faster when the first drops began to fall. The rain came down just as I reached the porch. Water swept sideways across the yard, and the wind tore several leaves loose and carried them away. The rain hit the roof so hard that almost every other sound disappeared. I closed the window, moved the chair farther inside, and stood there watching the road fade behind the curtain of rain. Thunder rolled somewhere in the distance. I made another cup of hot tea and sat near the door. There was nothing I needed to do right away. The laptop stayed closed, and my phone lit up with a notification before going dark again. The rain kept falling. A strong gust swept across the yard, shaking the branches near the fence. Several leaves broke loose, spun through the air, and landed on the wet ground. I watched them as the sound of rain on the roof slowly began to soften. Patches of light opened between the clouds. Water still dripped steadily from the edge of the roof, but the hills in the distance were beginning to appear again. I opened the door. The air was cooler after the rain. Water ran in a narrow stream along the edge of the yard, and one of the fallen leaves lay face down on the wet ground, partly pushed against the porch step. The flower near the fence was still there, but its petals were hanging down after. One petal had fallen to the ground. I bent down to look at it. When I'd walked past before the rain, it had just bloomed. My phone rang inside. It was my wife. The screen showed the familiar scene at home. One of the kids was sitting at the table doing something. The other ran through the background, then came back and squeezed into the frame. They both tried to tell me what had happened at the same time. My wife talked to me while doing something else, occasionally turning away to remind them about something. I asked how things were going at home. Before I left, there were things I'd worried she might have trouble handling on her own. Now, most of them had already been taken care of. Some things she'd handled herself. Some she'd asked someone else to help with. And a few things hadn't needed to be solved the way I'd imagined at all. One of the kids called out to me and held something right up against the camera. The image shook until I could only see part of their face. I laughed and told them to move the phone farther away. The conversation went on. Even without me there, the house still had meals, school days, things that needed to be handled, and laughter like this. I watched the screen a little longer. It wasn't that I felt unnecessary. And I wasn't disappointed that everything could keep going without me. It was simply different from what I'd always imagined. I used to think that if I didn't do certain things, they would be left undone. If I took a break, the work would pile up. If I wasn't home, my wife would have a hard time managing everything with the kids. Those thoughts had kept me working, worrying, and holding on to things I thought I couldn't let go of. But now I was far away from all of it. The work was still getting done. The kids were still moving through their days. My wife was still taking care of the house. And I was sitting in a small house in the mountains, watching them through a screen. The call ended, and the screen went dark. Outside, rainwater was still dripping from the leaves. I put the phone down and sat beside the door. A small pain suddenly returned in my abdomen. My hand moved there almost without thinking. I stayed still and waited. The feeling became clearer for a few breaths, then slowly I remembered that night curled up on the sofa. The pain had been so strong that almost everything else disappeared. Work didn't matter. The market board didn't matter. I just wanted the pain to stop. Then came the hospital, the bed, the light outside the window, the footsteps in the hallway. The pain that had taken all of my attention back then was now only a faint sensation beneath my hand. I lowered my hand. Outside the door, a drop of water gathered at the tip of leaf. It grew larger, then fell. The petals on the flower by the fence no longer stood the way they had when I first saw it bloom. The leaf that had always been in view whenever I sat on the porch had fallen from its branch and was now lying in the yard. Another time, I'd had to put on an extra layer because cold wind was coming through the door. By the time I closed the laptop later that day, heat had filled the room and I had to open the windows. Some days, clouds covered the entire mountainside and rain turned the road white. Before my tea had even cooled, a patch of blue sky would appear in the distance. None of these things waited to see whether I'd been washing long enough. They simply kept changing. Those changes had always been happening. I had just spent so much time between screens, work, my phone, and the market board that I was rarely still long enough to notice them. I still opened the laptop every day, but I spent less and less time in front of it. Emails came in. I answered what needed an answer, then closed the computer. Another issue would come up, and just as I was about to call someone, a new message would show that the others had already found a way to handle it. Things I'd once kept very close were beginning to have spaces where I was no longer in the middle of them. The one thing I stopped opening completely was the stock market app. A few times, my finger paused near the familiar icon. I still remembered the portfolio, I still knew I was holding an investment that had occupied my thoughts for months. But there was no decision I needed to make from this house. I locked the screen and put the phone back on the table. The meditation cushion on the porch was also becoming part of the house. After my tea, I'd bring it outside, sit down, and close my eyes. Some mornings, I could stay with my breathing a little longer. On other days, my thoughts moved constantly from one thing to another. Sometimes I could hear the wind clearly. Other times, it disappeared behind the stories in my head. The pain was the same. Sometimes I barely noticed it. Sometimes it stayed for a few breaths, then passed. I also stopped waiting for my thoughts to become quiet before I kept sitting. It was enough to notice a little of what was already there, then forget, and later notice that I'd forgotten. I didn't understand what that meant yet, but I no longer felt that I needed to understand it right away. I opened the door, and sunlight stretched across the yard all the way to the fence. Out of habit, my eyes went to the bush I'd been watching for days. The flower had completely wilted. Its last few petals were lying on the ground. I stepped into the yard. The leaf the rain had pushed against the porch step was gone too. The mountain winds had been strong enough to carry the dry leaves out of the yard overnight. The road ahead looked the same, but the things I'd seen along that road only a few days earlier were no longer exactly as they had been. By then, the pain in my abdomen was almost gone. I placed a hand there and remembered that this same body was already different from the one I'd had on the night I asked my wife to take me to the hospital. The pain had come. It had kept me in a hospital bed. It had brought me to this house. And little by little, it had begun to leave. I didn't know whether it would come back, just as I didn't know whether tomorrow would be cool or hot, which flower would bloom, which leaf would fall, what work would appear, or what story the kids might call to tell me. I was only beginning to see that so many things I'd lived with as if they would always stay where they were had never really been still at all. My phone vibrated. A work message said that the issue I'd worried about most had been completed. I read through the last few messages and looked at the names of the people who had carried it forward while I was away. And I turned off the screen. It had been finished without me being there. I put the phone down and stepped onto the porch. The cushion was still where I usually sat. The book was open on the chair. The guitar leaned against the wall. In the yard, the flower had wilted. The leaf from after the rain was gone. Farther away, the road still curved down the hillside just as it had on the day I arrived. My abdomen was almost completely quiet now. I stood there looking at the house and the yard that had held me for the past several days. When I came here, all I'd wanted was to step away from my old routine for a while. I wanted to give my body time to rest and look again at the way I'd been living. Now, work in the city was still moving forward. My wife and the kids were still moving through their days. And the things I'd watch every day on this mountain had been changing right in front of me. Nothing stopped to wait for me, and I couldn't stay here forever either. I went back inside. The clean clothes were folded and packed into my bag. The books were no longer scattered across the table. I closed the one I'd been reading and packed it with the others. The laptop went into its own. I brushed off the meditation cushion from the porch and brought it inside. The guitar was still leaning in the corner. I walked around the house once, checked the windows, then came back and picked it up. The room slowly began to look the way it had when I first arrived, except now the bag was sitting near the door instead of being unpacked. I stepped onto the porch one last time. The yard was still there. The road still curved down the hillside. The wind still moved through. Where the flower had bloomed, only the stem and a few green leaves remained. I didn't try to find anything else in the scene. The key turned in the lock, and the door closed behind me. I put the guitar in the car, with the bag beside it. In the rearview mirror, the small house disappeared behind the bend. The road down from the mountain gradually widened. More houses appeared, then shops, signs, intersections, and lines of traffic filled the view through the windshield. My phone beside me vibrated a few times. I answered one work call, texted my wife that I was almost home, then kept driving. The front door opened. I heard the kids running toward me almost immediately. They both started talking at once, and I couldn't tell which story belonged to which child. My wife stood behind them, smiling and telling them to let me bring my things inside first. I put the bag down and leaned the guitar back in its usual corner. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I kept listening until the younger one finished the story, then took the phone out. A work message was waiting. I read it, sent a short reply, and put the phone away. Dinner was filled with stories I'd missed while I was in the mountains. Some I'd already heard over the phone, but now the kids told me longer versions. My wife had already taken care of some things herself. A few things around the house had moved. Something belonging to the kids that I remembered seeing in the corner before I left was no longer there. I didn't ask when everything had changed. The house was still familiar. But the 2 weeks I'd been away hadn't stood still waiting for me to come back. I unpacked the bag. Clothes went back into the closet, books returned to the shelf, and the laptop went back onto the familiar desk. The guitar returned to its usual place too. The house in the mountains was behind me now. The elevator doors open. I walked down the familiar hallway, greeted a few people already at work, and pulled my chair in at my desk. The sounds of keyboards, phones, and short conversations surrounded me again. A coworker brought over the work that had been handled while I was away. I looked through it, asked about a few things, then handed it back. Everything had been completed. I opened my laptop. Emails appeared first, along with a few documents that needed my attention. New work quickly filled the space left by everything that had already been finished. I worked through each task, talked with the others, then leaned back in my chair. The familiar stock market app icon was still on the screen. I looked at it. For almost 2 weeks, I hadn't opened the market board. I hadn't checked my portfolio. I hadn't looked at the investment that had taken me through months of hope, worry, regret, and waiting. The market had kept opening every day without me watching. The cursor stopped over the icon. I clicked. The account began to load. After all those months, and especially after nearly 2 weeks without looking at my portfolio, what was going to happen had finally happened.